Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Friday, September 8th, 2023, and yesterday I made a video talking about the brand new polls from CNN surrounding the 2024 presidential election with hypothetical matchups between President Joe Biden and numerous Republicans, from Donald Trump to Ron DeSantis to Vivek Ramaswamy to Nikki Haley to Mike Pence to Tim Scott, that showed some very fascinating results between the two candidates, and none more notable than Nikki Haley's 6-point victory over Joe Biden in this head-to-head matchup, according to CNN and SSRS. Now, the reason why this is so significant is because Joe Biden and the many other Republicans in the race are all within a margin of error. Whether Joe Biden has the upper hand, the Republicans have the upper hand, all of them, with the exception of one, are within a position where maybe it could fluctuate up and down. But like I said, Nikki Haley, with her 6-point advantage amongst the same group of people that might give Donald Trump a 1-point advantage, Mike Pence a 2-point advantage, give Joe Biden a 1-point advantage over Vivek Ramaswamy, these differences here are negligible. The Nikki Haley one simply is not. And the narrative that has been taken away from this is the accurate one, the one that I believe has been really true to the narrative that Nikki Haley has been driving around the issue of abortion, talking about her issue as the first woman president, the main primary female candidate, female contender in the presidential race, the only, but certainly one of the most notable in U.S. history on the GOP side. And when she has spoken about some of the more prevalent issues, as I just mentioned abortion, this is probably one of the most regularly discussed ones. Following the 2022 midterms, she has taken a particularly powerful stance when it comes down to this issue, saying there needs consensus, there needs sensitivity, while every other male candidate on that stage is a hardliner on the issue of abortion. Not to say that she isn't pro-life and wouldn't enforce a ban if it was possible. She recognizes that it isn't possible. Said, even herself, on the debate stage, that Republicans don't have the votes in the Senate, we don't have the votes in the House, we don't have the means to pass a national abortion ban, so we should drop it. We should look for a consensus amongst the states, see if there's any way to get Democratic support for any type of restrictions. Spoiler alert, there probably won't be, but she's taking a much more sensible, more moderate approach, and to the average American, as we now see, that is resonating. And I think that her individually provides a huge contrast to many of the candidates in the race. Even though she isn't doing so well in the GOP primary, I think that honestly makes her uniquely perfect for the general election. Now, some of these lower level candidates I don't think would do nearly as well as her. In fact, many of them I think would underperform President Trump when it came down to the national general election against President Biden. But I do think there is something to be said that with Nikki Haley at 6%, but still doing very well in the general, independents like her. Republicans may not. And that's a problem for her because she needs to cross this first hurdle. But this video is about a hypothetical. Should there be some circumstance where Donald Trump is out of the race, or maybe she somehow climbs to victory in the GOP primary, we are assuming we've passed the convention and that Joe Biden and Nikki Haley are facing off against each other. Now, one major takeaway, too, that I want to point out, or one major point I want to point out before we get into this, is that Joe Biden is in a uniquely unpopular position. He's about 16 points between those who disapprove and those who approve. He's about to drop into the high 30s for the first time in months, in over a year, actually. So he's not exactly on track to be in a very good position for this re-election, and yet somehow nearly every contender is close. This should be a slam dunk election for the GOP. By standard political convention, an extremely unpopular president such as this, and not to say that he's extremely unpopular, but someone who, compared to President Obama, compared to many other candidates before, he's not doing well, right? So to see it, and we can actually compare to where he is, looking at the numbers, sure, he's close to Joe Biden, to Barack Obama, but still slightly below. That matters in very close elections when Joe Biden won the last one by 44,000 votes, being approved of 8 points nationwide. It doesn't just end there. Looking at his head-to-head numbers with President Trump, they're at the exact same point. You don't want to be on track to be at the same period, when you're working against the same type of opponent. I mean, Donald Trump sure lost the election, but doesn't that mean bad news for Joe Biden? You can see that George W. Bush was at a better position now than Joe Biden is today, that Bill Clinton was at a better position now, George H.W. Bush was at a better position now, Ronald Reagan was at a better position now. I mean, nearly every single modern day president, except for Donald Trump, was at a better position than Joe Biden is today. So that is underscoring a lot of what we talk about in this hypothetical election prediction because it matters. It means that this election should be a lot more favored towards the GOP than it actually is, but that's just the reality of the matter, that Joe Biden has, and the Democratic Party has had a unique opportunity to hold on to many of their states, many of their competitive races that maybe they otherwise might not be able to. Now, I will also mention this when I look through a lot of these states, that Nikki Haley is by far the least extreme candidate on that debate stage, with maybe the exception of Mike Pence. And this is about public perception. Her policy may be on par with Mike Pence, on par with Ron DeSantis, on par with many of the other candidates, but she's not coming across that way to the average American. She is the huge difference point between the other GOP contenders as the number one, only woman candidate on the stage, and number two, as someone who is the more moderate in terms of how she speaks to the public. Even though that may not be the winning strategy for the regular primary election, it certainly is the one for the general. When I watch Nikki Haley on the debate stage, and this is not some type of, video to push any type of narrative in favor of her. This is just me saying, from my honest perspective, when I made that tier list as to who did the best, my personal opinion is that Nikki Haley made the best case for her to be VP. She also made the best case to win the general election. And although that may not be translated directly into Republican surges, it certainly is translating to general election surges. Voters like that type of moderatism, even if it isn't necessarily moderate in the truest sense. So politics is weird. Like I've been saying, it's all about perception. She makes South Carolina safe. She makes Alaska safe. These states will be very large victories for the traditional type of conservative values that Nikki Haley represents. She is more a Mitt Romney Republican than a Donald Trump Republican by perception. She is a more moderate than she is an extremist by perception. That is what American politics is. We can argue all day back and forth about her policy. That's not what I'm interested in. I'm interested in her electability, Joe Biden's electability, and a potential matchup between the two. So we start off with a pretty strong lead for President Biden. I caution this and say, this is how it always is. It's 181 to 125. Not much of a difference here in any other hypothetical matchup. But that means we can actually get boiled down into likely states. States that we believe would be voting for Joe Biden, voting for Nikki Haley by margins between 5 and 15%, which means they're within a possibility of flipping. They could go to the opposite party, but they probably aren't going to. They're in a good position for where they are today. Probably won't change between now and election day, but random things happen in American politics all the time. And of course, we are over a year out from the election, so that's still within possibility. I would start off and say that Texas would be a likely red state. I think my argument mainly why I think Texas would be close is because one candidate has been able to make it close, and under his administration, Texas has been the closest it has ever been. And that is President Donald Trump. In 2016, he won the state by a margin of just 9 percentage points on the presidential. The reason why that's significant, Mitt Romney had won it 4 years prior by 16 points. And you think about that and say, okay, maybe it was just that every other state shifted to the left. But we know that simply isn't true. Between 2012 and 2016, Texas was one of the very few states that shifted to the left significantly, and it was a 7-point shift to the left. Utah shifted about 30 points. That's because Evan McMullin was in the race. You saw the Republicans lost vote share there, but the most notable shift outside of California came from the state of Texas. And even if you compare 2016 and 2020, almost every state shifted towards the left. But Texas additionally shifted 3 points towards the Democratic Party. A good look, but mostly because of President Trump. And you can see again, under his administration in 2018 versus 2012, you can see that Texas shifted 13 points to the left. Again, how did this happen? Why did it happen? It happened because Beto O'Rourke was a resounding candidate at the time, and number two, because Donald Trump was so unpopular that voters turned out in droves in Texas, nearly flipped the House delegation there towards the Democrats, and it made Texas significantly more blue than it had been prior to. So, why am I mentioning this? Because Nikki Haley, I think, could revert it back. I think they are happy with the Mitt Romney type of Republican. George Bush won it by 23, McCain won it by double digits, Romney won it by 16. Trump has failed to do so twice, and probably would fail to do so again. But Nikki Haley, I think she calms the suburbs. I think she does well in states that we might not otherwise expect because she is, again, perceived to be more moderate, and that 6-point advantage she has nationwide simply cannot be ignored. It's not to say that it's a slam dunk for her as the presidential nominee. It will always be competitive no matter who it is. That is the nature of our presidential general elections, especially with a president who's down about 16 points nationwide. So you have to keep that in mind. But Texas and Florida, because I just threw it in there, are likely to be blue, red states, as are Iowa and Ohio. I think that the white working class has reverted away from the Democratic Party, especially in these states, especially in the Rust Belt. Not enough to flip Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania easily back, because that will still have to be hard fought. But what Donald Trump did in 2016 was crack the blue wall in the truest sense. Barack Obama had one Iowa, he had one Ohio, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania. Donald Trump swept all 5. And not exactly by narrow margins. Yes, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania were close. But you're talking an 8-point swing in Wisconsin, a 10-point swing in Michigan, a 7-point swing in Pennsylvania. Iowa swung by 14 points. Ohio swung by 11 points. These shifts seem to be a one-off. And then in 2018, Republicans won again. In 2020, Donald Trump won again, but not in Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. So that's why those aren't characterized just yet. We'll talk about those once we actually get into it. But Iowa, Ohio, Texas, and Florida, right now states that I think Nikki Haley would take by a likely margin. So now she's ahead of President Biden. But President Biden obviously is going to do well as well. I think he wins Maine at large. I think he's going to get that one by a likely margin. Not much to be argumented there. Colorado, New Mexico might seem like states that would narrow down, but keep in mind, Colorado is a state that just voted for the Democratic candidates in 2022 by 15 points. And get this, although Nikki Haley is on the right side on the issue of abortion, Joe O'Dea was in many respects similar to Nikki Haley. He was a moderate, perceived rhino. He was somebody who they thought Republicans would be able to turn out Democratic and independent voters to the right, simply because he was a more moderate Republican. He lost by 15 points. Donald Trump lost the state by 14 points. I do not think there will be enough reversion within Colorado or New Mexico, which also went to Joe Biden by double digits in 2020, to make these states narrower than likely. I think they will narrow up, but I do not think it will be significant enough to say Colorado's now a 5 to less point margin of victory for the Democrats. Neither is New Mexico. So that brings Joe Biden to about a point of 198 electoral votes. Where we are now on this presidential map, I don't think any other states can be characterized as likely for either candidate. I think what we're working with is an extremely competitive map. I think all of them will be heavily invested in this hypothetical scenario, and I also think is a warning sign for Democrats should Donald Trump tap Nikki Haley to be VP, which I think he will. I think that's becoming increasingly more likely that Nikki Haley is that VP nominee. It would be the smartest choice. I don't know if Donald Trump's going to make it, but it's very clear that she provides a level of electability that, as I said, no other GOP contender can offer, including the former president himself. So, looking around the map, I still think that Democrats are on track to win Virginia. My caution here is that Glenn Youngkin and Nikki Haley seem to be cut from the same cloth. A presidential election, though, is very different than a gubernatorial one. I think that was just a pushback against President Biden, especially after the Afghanistan withdrawal, a uniquely powerful campaign centered around critical race theory, centered around the failures of the Terry McAuliffe governorship. And although, I wouldn't argue it was a failure in totality, who's popular by the time he left, the framing of this election became about parents versus McAuliffe, and of course, parents, especially in Northern Virginia, turned out in droves against Terry McAuliffe and voted for Glenn Youngkin, even though they might be traditionally Democratic Party voters. I don't think Nikki Haley has the same effect. I think she narrows it down for sure. This is a state that Joe Biden won by 10 points in 2020, so to see it narrowed down to lean is certainly a sign that this election is probably not going to go to Joe Biden, number one, but number two, that there is some type of reversion in the suburbs. There is this type of unique appeal that she has that makes her unqualified for the primary, but qualified for the general election. Again, it's this really, really interesting a good comparison. But Joe Biden, I still think, wins the state of Virginia. I also think that, arguably, he would win Nebraska's 2nd district. I do recognize that Nikki Haley is a bit more Mitt Romney-esque, but I also will say that this 2nd district, even though it has been drawn to be just Biden plus 6, that's not the worst place to be. I also want to say that there has been a lot of distrust specifically within the Omaha region around the Republican Party in general. They're extremely well received and well liked. Republican representative in Nebraska's 2nd has actually seen a narrowing down of his campaign in 2022. I think this is an individual case that might show the unique qualities of Nebraska's 2nd, where Don Bacon won by just 2.7%. The reason why that matters was because in 2020, he won by 4.6 in a less favorable district. The Nebraska legislature is Republican controlled. They had a Republican governor, have a Republican governor, 2 Republicans in the state Senate, in the Senate. This is a Republican state, and they knew what they were doing. They drew Nebraska's 2nd district to be about 3 to 4 points more Republican, and yet somehow it narrowed down. Why? The general distrust for the GOP is rampant. It makes and engrosses on Republican advantages within this district. You can even see in 2018, Don Bacon won by roughly the same amount that he did in 2022 with a more favorable district and a national environment about 11 points to the right of where it was. Any type of national environment less than R+3, Nebraska's 2nd might be up to go, which is why I think that Nikki Haley also would lose this district. I think, again, she provides that opportunity to win in other states, but it's too blue, same as Virginia, same as Colorado, New Mexico, for me to argue that she would be able to win there. So looking around the map, we're at 108 toss-up electoral votes. Still, a ways to go. So we'll start off by looking at the Northeast. I think Maine's 2nd District is still red, but not by a super heavy amount. I don't think she drives out the white working class in the way that Donald Trump does, but she makes up for it in places that matters. In New Hampshire, I still also think that this is a state that does push back against Republicans in a way that we haven't seen. I think you've seen a general discontent for the Republican Party in this state. I think Nikki Haley comes close, very close. You're talking a 2 to 3 point victory here for Joe Biden, down from what was an 8-point victory, but I still think ultimately Joe Biden has that upper hand in the Northeast region. Nikki Haley is arguably, again, the most electable. I still think New Hampshire and Virginia and Colorado and Nebraska 2nd and New Mexico can't be cracked as easily. I also think Minnesota is in a position where, Joe Biden isn't going to lose the state. Nikki Haley, as did Marco Rubio, I think would do very well in the type of politics in Minnesota. I don't know if she wins the state. The white working class droves that turned out for Donald Trump, I do not see turning out the same way for Nikki Haley. That is a fundamental problem. Donald Trump inspired something in a group of people that previously were Obama voters. I mean, there were a lot of Obama-Trump voters that were Trump again in 2020 that might not be inspired to vote for Nikki Haley or just simply wouldn't care enough, right? Donald Trump turned out people who really, really cared. Hillary Clinton and Joe Biden both had enthusiasm problems. Donald Trump does not. He knows how to turn out a base, and typically speaking, older, whiter, wealthier voters are the most likely to vote in elections. That just so happens to be the GOP base, but in Minnesota specifically, I think the bench here is a little bit too high for Republicans to really knock off its legs, take it away from the Democrats. I think Minnesota is going blue in this hypothetical scenario, but I do think that Nikki Haley does very well in North Carolina. I think she does very well, honestly, in Georgia, right? And I know it's crazy to think about that these are states where you have Democratic victories in Georgia in both Senate races, one on the presidential level for the first time since 92. But I caution you and say, Joe Biden's victory there wasn't exactly resounding, right? This was a victory of 0.24%. And looking at the 2022 midterm elections, yes, Democrats did win it, but I also want you to take a look at the margins when it came down to the election results. 2022, Warnock won by 2.8% against Herschel Walker. Herschel Walker was an extreme candidate. So many scandals, so much against him. He, completely defeated Republican Party at this point, and yet Warnock was only able to win by 2.8%. It shows that Georgia, when put up with the right politician, can vote red. And in 2022, on that same ballot that Warnock won by a point, went to a runoff, won by 3. Brian Kemp won by 8 points against Stacey Abrams, a very national figure, very well-known figure, but just simply, Brian Kemp was the right Republican, and she was the wrong Democrat. That's why I think Georgia would go to Nikki Haley by a narrow amount. I don't think it's going to be a Stacey Abrams type of defeat, but I certainly think it would be a state that votes back for the GOP because of how close it was. And again, this is the type of Republican that excels in this state. Donald Trump is not. North Carolina, I think, still is going to maintain its Republican identity. It still remains to be a red state. So that bumps up Nikki Haley to 251. Joe Biden remains at 226. Now, looking at Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, I think Joe Biden could hold on to Michigan. I think it would be very close. I think it would be a lean state again, if not a tilt state. It's going to be competitive. As I said, Nikki Haley doesn't have the Donald Trump type of enthusiasm or enforcement of his own base to push it out there. She's not going to get the same people that Donald Trump did, but she's going to get a lot closer. The voters here are still competitive voters. These states are still very competitive states. Barack Obama was an anomaly. I just want you to take a look really quickly. 2012, sure. Likely. 2008, likely, right? But in 2004, it was competitive. 0.4, 3.4, 2.5 in 2000, competitive 0.2, 5, 4, right? 96, sure, Clinton did well, but think about the reason why. It wasn't because he was dominating, it was because there was a third-party candidate. These states are historically competitive, especially in elections that aren't the presidential. Take a look, Wisconsin has a Republican senator, Michigan did as recently, had a Republican senator, Pennsylvania had one up until 2022. There's a reason for that. These states are competitive, and I think Nikki Haley does have the opportunity to win in Wisconsin, win in Pennsylvania, and thus with it, the presidency, propping her up to 280 electoral votes to Joe Biden's 241. Now, I grapple a bit with these remaining two states. I don't think Nikki Haley has this type of advantage amongst Hispanic voters that she needs necessarily to do extremely well in Nevada and Arizona. But I do think that similar, along the same lines as how Georgia went red, that Nikki Haley could also win Arizona. I am a bit apprehensive because I do think that this state is one that is more Democratic than Georgia. has proven itself in 2022 and elections beyond, and before. But I also recognize that, hey, some of these states are covered from the same cloth, and you can find some similarities. I think Nikki Haley would narrowly win Arizona. Carrie Lake got very close, and had she just been slightly more moderate/electable in the way Nikki Haley was, I think she could have won. Now, will the national environment be as favorable? I don't know. But these national numbers so far seem to suggest that they might be. With that, Arizona, I think, votes red. But Nevada, I think, slightly stays for Joe Biden. It sort of is like the Republican Party's New North Carolina. They're constantly fighting for it, constantly vying for it, win a one-off governor's race, but don't win anything else. The House delegation is Democratic, the Senate delegation is Democratic, the presidential history is Democratic, and I think Democrats still hold on to it, especially if Nikki Haley isn't making massive gains amongst Hispanic voters. I really think you're going to see maybe Asian Americans shift in favor of her. I think you might also see white Americans, suburban Americans specifically, shift in favor of Nikki Haley. But I don't think you'll see as much of a minority shift in favor of Nikki Haley as you might have seen with even someone like Donald Trump, for instance, which is crazy to think about, but the reality we live in. So in this hypothetical, Nikki Haley defeats Joe Biden 291 to 247. She flips Wisconsin, she flips Pennsylvania, she flips Georgia, and Arizona. Joe Biden holds on to the rest, but at the end of the day, that doesn't matter. It's the first 270, and she has gotten there. So all to say that I do agree with the narrative that she is the most electable Republican. You can see that in data point after data point, but she isn't the most electable in the primary, and that's her problem. But it also is, again, a case for Donald Trump to pick her as VP. Where we are right now, again, 291 to 247, a very interesting map. I encourage you to agree or disagree with me in the comment section down below, but I'd love to hear your guys' thoughts in general. 291 to 247, that is what I would bet on today if I was to draw the map. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for my 2024 presidential election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today.